I was in a thrift store a while back when I saw this digital thermometer and probe. If you've seen my other video where I make a digital thermometer, you know that I'm interested in this type of thing. After I brought it home, I noticed that on the back there was an FCC ID. That means that this thermometer is probably wireless. So, curious, I looked up the FCC ID on the FCC's website. From the test documentation, I can see that this device operates at 433 MHz, which is part of what the US designates as the ISM band. ISM, or Industrial, Scientific, and Medical, is a radio frequency band where you find a lot of things like car keys, window shade openers, baby monitors, and a ton of other home wireless devices. It's much lower frequency than, say, Wi-Fi or a lot of Bluetooth communication, but is sometimes preferred for its longer range when lower data transfer is acceptable. I had been considering experimenting with putting my homemade barbecue thermometer on 433 for a while, so I thought this was a great find. All I had to do was figure out how to read the wireless signals coming out from this thing. The first thing I did was grab my software-defined radio, in this case the HackRF, and go and record some signals. This is my first time decoding wireless communication, so I didn't really know how to proceed. I opened the files in Audacity since they were WAV files, and the signal looked much more like a digital signal than an analog signal. But short of hand assigning ones and zeros, I was unsure of how to change this captured signal into actual data. I did some digging and found this powerful piece of software called Universal Radio Hacker. URH is actually quite easy to get started with. After importing your file, you can set a noise floor with the red area. This tells URH that it ought to ignore everything inside of that noise floor as background RF. Afterwards, you can play around with some other parameters. The most important one is the sample rate. Although WAV is lossless, it still samples at a certain number of times per second. This parameter tells URH how many samples to consider one bit of information. URH is so cool because as you do this, you can watch it try to decode your signal in pretty much real time. Here, I set the sample rate to 1200, and by highlighting parts of my WAV readout, I can see that it corresponds with identified bits of data. Likewise, when I highlight the bits it's found, I can see that URH is showing me the part of the signal that created that bit. After this, you can set the center. The center is the line that separates the ones from the zeros. Everything above the line is a 1 and everything below is a 0, so you want your line more or less smack in the middle. I took 3 different kinds of temperature readings. The middle ones were around room temp with me holding the probe. The low ones were where I stuck the probe in the refrigerator, and the high ones were where I stuck the probe in some water that I boiled. The middle temps spanned from the high 70s to the mid 80s, and low temps gave me 5 samples that were all at exactly 40.3 degrees, which makes sense. The high temperatures gave me 2 different temps, 208.2 and 208.4. For each data point that the thermometer broadcasts, I can see that it transmits the same data 6 times. It then gives a 7th, which is almost the same but seems to end early. URH makes it easy to see that there's a sequence of transmissions followed by a certain number of samples skipped. Note that whether it's a thermometer, the HackRF, or my parameters in URH, the samples don't always turn out identical. Sometimes an extra bit gets interpolated. Once I got all the data into URH, I took what I thought was the best sample at each temperature, then wrote it into a JSON. I figured that the next step would be easy. After all, it's just zeros and ones, and I'm pretty good at zeros and ones. I probably just need to find the part that encodes the numerical value from the readout, and that'll be that. I cannot emphasize how wrong I was. I should say that I have basically no experience with cryptography. In fact, I'm pretty new to playing with SDRs and embedded devices in general. The expectation that this would be easy is pure hubris on my part. First of all, the transmissions were different lengths. The ones that were similar in temp were similar in length, but for some reason both the refrigerator and boiling water readings were longer than the room temperature readings. I tried everything I could think of or find online. Big endian, little endian, single float, double float, string, IEEE 754, bitwise shifts, reversing bits, inverting bits, everything. And nothing worked. I even asked every LLM that I had access to, and they all would try a bunch of stuff, none of which worked. And they would end up insisting that it's Manchester encoding, even when I pointed out that it's clearly not. So if you're one of those people who's worried that AI is going to take over the world's nukes, fear not. All we have to do is secure it with barbecue thermometers. In a moment of clarity, I thought it would be a good idea to look back at the FCC filing. In addition to test data, there are typically also block diagrams, schematics, and other information about the device that's needed for it to get licensed. I thought that maybe if I could identify the microcontroller, I could figure out the likely communication protocol and work from there. But that's when I ran into this.
We hereby request confidential treatment of information accompanying this application as outlined below. Block diagram schematics operational description. The above materials contain trade secrets and proprietary information not customarily released to the public. The public disclosure of these materials may be harmful to the applicant and provide unjustified benefits to its competitors.
Ooh. And the physical chip itself? It's hidden under an epoxy blob. This brings up the very interesting topic of 47 CFR 0.459 and 17 USC 1201J, but I'll let you guys look into that in your own time. The first breakthrough that I had was when I found out that regardless of overall length, each signal had the same number of ones. They all had 34 ones. This put me onto an encoding method called fixed weight or constant weight encoding. Fixed weight encoding is sometimes used for wireless communication since it has built-in error checking. Bits of information are paired, so if your data is 101, it's followed by its inverse, so 010. This means that the wireless receiver has two chances to capture the data, once when it's in its first state, then again as the inverse. This also means that there will also be the same number of ones and zeros in any given transmission. But if this is the type of encoding that this code uses, it still doesn't explain why the transmissions are different lengths. Additionally, there are nowhere near 50% ones in my binary. But that got me thinking. The data must be encoded in the positions of the 34 ones. So the next thing I did was generate a list of the index of all of the ones. After spending some time with this, it looked like each sequence of indices had some strange patterns. Specifically, the interval from one number to the next seemed to not be random. For instance, in the binary for 84.0 degrees, the ones were either spaced apart by 2 or by 5. After some more research, I think this is what would be considered pulse position modulation, or PPM. Instead of signal being a 1 and lack of signal being a 0, PPM uses 1 to designate the boundary between bits, and the value of the bit is the distance in zeros between those ones. This means that my breakdown of 2s and 5s is actually 0s and 1s, respectively. The interesting thing, though, is that it's not always 5s and 2s, which is why some of the binary lengths are so different. For instance, the binary for 40.3 degrees has 4s and 7s. But it was pretty easy to specify the 0 as the minimum gap value and the 1 as the maximum gap value in Python. So it didn't take too long to take the 34 indices and calculate 33 gaps and turn that into 33 binary values. The last bit often didn't fit into a 1 or a 0 spacing, so I just dropped it. I suspect that this last bit was to tell the receiver that the message would repeat again since it was missing from the last repetition in the cluster. This means I now had 32 binary values per transmission. And at this stage I felt pretty confident I was on the right track, because now not only were all of my binaries the same length, the first 13 bits were also identical for every data point. I would imagine that these are some kind of transmitter identifier, since it seems like a ReadyCheck set had multiple transmitters connected to one central receiver, at least from the info that I could find online. This meant that I could focus on the remaining 19 bits, because that's where the actual temperature data had to be. I was stuck here for a while, but then I noticed something very odd. The transmission for 77.7 and 83.5 were identical except for 2 bits. So logically, the difference in one or both of these bits had to represent the difference between 77.7 and 83.5. I then employed a somewhat obscure and specialized mathematical method to discern the difference between these temperatures, called subtraction, and found that the difference is 5.8. Not very interesting. However, if you translate 77.7 and 83.5 from freedom height into science, you get 28.6 and 25.4, which have a difference of 3.2. This number is very interesting, because this number is the 6th number in a binary sequence. So this gave me the hint that instead of randomly trying to find the correct window, one of these bits is probably in the 6th position of a binary sequence. This also hinted that the number was probably encoded as 10x the Celsius temperature as an integer. But while 254 and 286 weren't anywhere in the binary, one window I tested gave me 454 and 486, which matched in the tens and ones place but was off by 2 in the hundreds place. I took this window and applied it to all of the numbers and found that in each instance the resulting integer was 200 higher than 10x the Celsius temperature. So this window had to be the one that I was looking for. To get a temperature that matched the readout, I just had to first index the encoded ppm binary from the 13th to the 24th bit, convert it into an integer, subtract 200, divide by 10, then convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit. I suspect that it's actually from the 12th to the 24th bit, since these numbers make much more sense, and just added a leading 0 for all of the data points that I had. Plus, going to 12 gives it a very nice breakdown. 12 bits of preamble, 12 bits of number data, then 8 leftover mystery bits. So what comes next? My original plan with this project was to make a PiPico or ESP32 receiver so I could actually use it in real time as a barbecue thermometer. But since the decoding process is so complex, I don't know if I'll be able to do that. I know that I could code the workflow for the cryptographic processing, but I'm not very sure where to start with driving the functionality for the software-defined radio stuff or automating Universal Radio Hacker. If anyone has any insights or any ideas on that, or any idea of what those last 8 bits are, I would love to hear them. Otherwise, that's it for now, and thank you for coming along on this journey.